When my son got married, I never told him that his grandmother had left me $11 million 2 years before the wedding. Thank God I kept that to myself, because 4 months into the marriage, my new daughter in law showed up at my house with a lawyer and a stack of paperwork, asking me to sign over power of attorney just to make things easier down the road. She had no idea I'd already figured out exactly what she was doing. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 63 years old. I live outside Columbus, Ohio, and until recently I was just a retired electrician who spent his afternoons restoring an old Ford pickup in the driveway. Nobody at the diner where I get my coffee every morning knew what was sitting in my accounts. Nobody at church knew either. And that's exactly how I wanted it to stay. Stick with me on this one, because it doesn't end the way you'd think. If this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from tonight. You're going to want to see how this played out. My mother's name was Ruth Hensley, and she was not an easy woman to know. She grew up poor in West Virginia, married my father young, and after he died in a mining accident when I was 9, she raised 3 kids alone by working 2 jobs and never once complaining about it out loud. She was hard in a way that made sense once you understood where she came from. She didn't hug much. She didn't say, "I love you," easily. But she showed up every school play, every football game, every hospital visit when my kids were born. She was there in the back row with her purse in her lap, watching everything and saying very little. What most people didn't know about my mother was that she'd spent 40 years quietly investing. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for a regional trucking company for 3 decades, and somewhere along the way she started putting money into index funds, then real estate, then more index funds. She never told any of us. She drove a 12-year-old Buick until the day she died. She clipped coupons out of habit, even when she didn't need to. My brother Dale used to joke that Mom was one bad winter away from the poorhouse, and none of us ever thought to question that. She passed 2 years ago in April, in her sleep, at 86 years old. No warning. The doctor said her heart just stopped, peacefully, which was the one gentle thing life ever gave that woman. I remember getting the call from my sister Carol and sitting in my kitchen for almost an hour afterward, not moving, just holding the phone in my lap. I thought I understood grief. I did not understand what was coming next. The will reading happened about 2 weeks later, in a small office in Charleston, with a lawyer named Edwin Pruitt, who had handled my mother's affairs for almost 20 years. I expected the house, maybe some savings, a modest inheritance split 3 ways between me, Dale, and Carol. That's not what happened. My mother had left almost everything to me specifically not because she loved me more. Mr. Pruitt explained carefully, but because she'd written in her own instructions that Dale had never learned to hold on to a dollar, and Carol was married to a man who'd spend it before the ink dried, she trusted me to use it wisely. And, if I saw fit, to help my siblings quietly over time, rather than handing them a lump sum to burn through. The number, once everything settled the investment accounts, the 2 rental properties she'd bought decades earlier for almost nothing, the life insurance came to just over $11 million. I asked Mr. Pruitt to repeat himself. Twice. Not because I didn't hear him the first time, but because it didn't seem like something that could be true about my mother, who reused tinfoil and complained about the price of eggs until the week she died. There was a letter, too, sealed, handwritten, addressed to me alone. I didn't read it in that office. I folded it into my coat pocket and drove home with both hands locked on the wheel, feeling like the truck might tip over if I took a curve too fast. That night, at my kitchen table, I made a decision I'd end up keeping for 2 full years. I wasn't going to tell anyone. Not Dale, not Carol, not my son Michael, who was 28 at the time, and dating a woman he'd met at work named Bridget. I told myself it was temporary. I just needed time to think clearly, to figure out what kind of man I wanted to be with that kind of money, before it started changing how people looked at me. I had no idea yet how right that instinct would turn out to be. Michael had been with Bridget Calloway for almost a year and a half by the time my mother passed. Bridget was 26, worked in what she called client relations for a financial services firm downtown, and she had a way of asking questions that always sounded casual but never quite were. She was polished, good posture, good handshake, always complimenting my workshop or my truck or whatever happened to be nearby. The kind of charm that plays wonderfully at a barbecue and starts to feel a little rehearsed after the third visit. Michael was crazy about her, and I wanted to be happy for him. I really did try. But there was something about the way Bridget circled certain topics that never sat right with me. Early on, before my mother had even passed, She asked me once at a 4th of July cookout, almost offhand, whether my mother had left things in order and whether our family had ever talked about estate planning. I laughed it off, told her my mother was tighter with a dollar than anyone alive and there probably wasn't much to plan for. Bridget nodded slowly and moved the conversation somewhere else. But she asked a version of that same question again about 2 months later, wrapped inside a comment about how important it is for families to be transparent about money so nobody gets blindsided. When Michael proposed that fall, right around the time my mother's estate had finally cleared probate, Bridget started showing up to family dinners with little remarks about building a secure foundation and making sure everyone's protected. I told myself I was being an overly suspicious old man, that a young woman planning a wedding just naturally starts thinking about the future. But some quiet part of me had already started keeping score. And once you start noticing a pattern, you can't stop seeing it everywhere. Wedding planning turned into its own kind of slow motion stress that spring. Bridget wanted a venue out at a restored barn property 40 minutes north of the city, the kind of place that charges more for one Saturday than most families spend in 3 months. Michael kept apologizing to me about the cost every time it came up, telling me they'd figure it out on their own, maybe push the date back a year to save more. Every time he said that, something in my chest twisted a little tighter. I had $11 million sitting quietly across 4 different accounts, and my son was calling around to see if anyone would rent them folding chairs for less than $8 a seat. I ended up quietly covering most of the wedding costs myself, wiring the deposit to the venue directly, paying the caterer, covering the band, and telling Michael it came from savings and a modest life insurance payout from his grandmother. That part wasn't exactly a lie, just not the whole truth either. Bridget, for her part, seemed very interested in exactly how those payments were getting made. She asked Michael more than once who was handling the deposits, and whether his dad had come into anything recently, always phrased like a light joke. But her eyes weren't joking when she said it. Michael brushed it off every time, telling her his father had just been careful with money his whole life and had finally decided to spoil them a little. I let him believe that story too, because it was easier than opening a door I wasn't ready to open yet. Looking back now, I can see exactly how deliberate Bridget was being, laying groundwork, asking questions that always sounded reasonable on the surface. At the time, I told myself I was overthinking a nervous bride. I was wrong about that, and I'd find out exactly how wrong before the year was out. The wedding itself, if I'm being completely honest, was beautiful. Michael looked exactly like his father did, like me 35 years earlier, nervous and grinning like an idiot. For a few hours that October afternoon, I let myself just be a proud dad instead of a man quietly sitting on a small fortune nobody knew about. The barn looked incredible, strung with lights, everyone dressed up, the leaves just starting to turn outside the big open doors. Bridget's mother, Sandra, a sharp woman from Cincinnati, with a talent for compliments that also sounded like warnings, cornered me near the bar at one point and said, out of nowhere, "It must be such a relief for you, knowing Michael's marrying into a family that understands the importance of financial planning." I smiled and said something forgettable, but I noticed exactly how she watched my face afterward, like she was checking for a reaction. During the toast, Bridget stood up with a glass of champagne and talked about building something secure together and making smart decisions as a team, which struck me as an unusual thing to emphasize at a wedding instead of, say, love or partnership or any of the things people usually toast to. A few guests laughed politely. Michael looked happy and a little embarrassed, the way grooms do when a speech runs a little strange. I clapped along with everyone else, but underneath it I felt that same cold, quiet feeling I'd had at the cookout months earlier. This wasn't nervous excitement. This was a woman who had already been thinking hard about numbers she didn't officially know existed. I danced with my son. I hugged him tight. I told him I loved him and that I was proud of the man he'd become. Every word of that was completely true. But driving home that night alone in my truck, I knew something was coming, even if I couldn't say exactly what yet. The honeymoon lasted a week, a trip to the Smoky Mountains that I quietly paid for as a wedding gift, again dressed up as money I'd supposedly been setting aside for years. When they got back, something shifted. Bridget started calling me. Not Michael, me, directly, which she'd never really done before. She'd ask if I wanted to come over for Sunday dinner, or if I needed help organizing my paperwork, offering to look through my files and get everything digitized and easier to manage, something she had zero background in and even less genuine interest in before the wedding. At first, I told myself this was just a new daughter-in-law trying to build a relationship with her husband's father. I wanted to believe that, because some part of me still hoped Bridget could be a good partner for my son. But the calls kept coming, always warm, always casual, and always eventually circling back to some version of the same question. How was I doing financially since retirement? Did I have a good system for tracking my accounts? Had I ever thought about consolidating everything so it'd be easier to manage as I got older, especially if something happened suddenly, the way it had with his grandmother? She said all of this in the same gentle, concerned voice you'd use asking about someone's knee replacement. But I spent 31 years running electrical for commercial buildings, and you learn fast how to spot somebody buttering you up before they ask for something bigger. Bridget was doing the exact same thing Ruth Hensley's bookkeeping instincts would have spotted in about 4 seconds flat, just with a manicure and a wedding band. One Saturday afternoon, she showed up unannounced with a six-pack of the beer Michael liked, sat on my back porch for almost 2 hours, and steered the conversation no fewer than 3 times toward making sure everything's protected in case anything ever happens. I nodded along and gave her nothing. But that night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the same table where I'd decided to keep my secret 2 years earlier, and I admitted something to myself. My daughter-in-law knew. I needed to know how much Bridget actually knew and how she'd found it out. So I called an old friend of mine, Ray Odom, a retired county sheriff's deputy who did private consulting work on the side, mostly background checks for small business owners who'd been burned by bad hires. I told Ray the whole situation over coffee at the diner, laid it out plainly: my mother, the will, the 11 million, Bridget's questions creeping in earlier and earlier. Ray didn't look surprised. He told me probate records are public in Ohio, same as most states, meaning anyone with a little patience and a library card can search county court websites and find out exactly what an estate was worth and who inherited it. It took him about 10 minutes on his laptop right there at the diner to pull up my mother's filing and confirm the number himself, just to show me how easy it was. Then he asked me something that made my stomach drop. He asked when Michael had proposed to Bridget. I told him, and Ray pulled up the date my mother's estate had cleared probate, cross-referenced against the county filing index. My mother's estate became public record in early September. Michael proposed the last week of September. Ray looked at me across that diner table and said quietly, "Walter, I think you need to ask yourself if this was ever really about your son." I didn't want to believe it. I told myself plenty of young people get engaged in the fall, that I was building a conspiracy out of timing and a few too many questions on a back porch. But some part of me, the part that had spent months keeping score without wanting to admit it already, knew Ray was right. And I needed real proof before I said a single word to anyone. Ray offered to dig deeper, and I said yes before I'd even finished thinking it through, because at that point, I needed the truth more than I needed my own comfort. It took him about 3 weeks. What he found wasn't just uncomfortable, it was almost a pattern you could set a clock by. Bridget had been engaged once before, 5 years earlier, to a man named Curtis, whose family owned a chain of auto dealerships across 2 counties. That engagement ended 7 months in, right around the time Curtis's father restructured the business and moved most of the ownership into a trust that cut Curtis out of direct control. There was no lawsuit, no public drama, just a quiet breakup that Curtis's old college roommate described to Ray as her losing interest the second the money situation got complicated. Ray also found a pattern in Bridget's job history: 2 different financial services firms in 4 years, each departure coming not long after client complaints about her overstepping into personal financial matters with older, wealthier clients. At one firm, she'd been let go after a client's family accused her of encouraging an elderly widow to add her as a secondary contact on retirement accounts. Nothing criminal exactly, nothing that would hold up cleanly in front of a judge, but all of it painted the same picture. Over and over, a woman who found financial opportunity in relationships and moved fast once she sensed real money nearby. I sat with that file in my garage for a long time that night. The same garage where I'd spent 2 years, slowly bringing that old Ford back to life. And I felt something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with my mother's money and everything to do with my son's future. I wasn't angry yet. I was getting ready. I decided not to say anything to Michael right away, because I needed to see exactly how far Bridget was willing to go, and because some stubborn part of me still hoped I was wrong. I didn't have to wait long. About a month later, Bridget called and said she wanted to stop by with something important, just some paperwork, nothing to worry about, in that same easy tone she used for everything. I told her Saturday morning would work fine. When Saturday came, she pulled into my driveway with a leather folder under her arm, and a man I didn't recognize walking beside her, a man she introduced simply as Neil. "He's an estate attorney, Walter. He does some consulting for the firm I work at. I thought it'd be smart to have him walk you through this properly. My stomach dropped the second I saw his briefcase. Bridget sat at my kitchen table, the very same table, and slid the folder toward me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She explained it as a family protection plan, something Neil had drafted specifically for peace of mind, a document that would grant her limited power of attorney over certain financial decisions, in case anything ever happened suddenly, framed entirely around love and caution and looking out for an aging father-in-law. She even brought up my mother's sudden passing as an example, said it so gently, like she was genuinely worried about me, like the whole thing had been born out of concern rather than calculation. Neil sat quietly at the end of the table with his own folder, waiting for a signature that would have handed my daughter-in-law legal reach into money she wasn't even supposed to know existed. I looked at that folder for a long moment. Then I looked up at Bridget and asked her, calmly, if she wanted to know how I'd found out about Curtis. Her face changed instantly. The polish cracked right off her in real time. She asked what I was talking about, but her voice had lost that easy, practiced smoothness, and something tighter and more nervous took its place. I told her plainly, no yelling, no dramatics, just facts, laid out one after another, the way I used to walk an apprentice through a wiring diagram. I told her about the probate timeline, about the engagement that ended right when Curtis's family restructured their business, about the job history Ray had pulled together, about the widow and the retirement accounts. I told her I knew about her questions at the cookout, her calls about consolidating my finances, every single thread she thought she'd been laying so carefully over the past year and a half. Neil sat frozen at the end of the table, clearly realizing this was not the routine signing he'd been brought in for. Bridget tried to recover, said I was misunderstanding everything, that this was purely about family security, that any reasonable person plans ahead. I let her talk for almost a full minute without interrupting, because I wanted her to hear exactly how thin it sounded once it was actually spoken out loud, instead of dressed up in a soft, concerned voice on my back porch. When she finally stopped, I slid the folder back across the table, closed, unsigned, and told her I wasn't going to be signing anything that day or any day after it. Then I told her something else I'd been holding on to for weeks, waiting for the right moment to say. I told her Michael was going to hear every single word of this from me before the end of that week. Neil left almost immediately after that, gathering his folder without a word, clearly wanting no part of whatever this had become. Bridget stayed a few minutes longer, cycling between anger and a kind of desperate backpedaling, telling me I was going to destroy her marriage over assumptions, that Michael would never believe any of this coming from me, because it would sound like a controlling father trying to run his son's life. That part actually worried me a little, because she wasn't entirely wrong about how it might look on the surface. A father with a secret fortune, suddenly accusing his new daughter-in-law right after refusing to sign over any control. So instead of just telling Michael my version of the story, I decided to show him the actual proof, the probate timeline, Ray's research, and something I hadn't mentioned to Bridget yet, a recording. I'd started recording our conversation quietly on my phone the moment Neil walked through my door, tucked into my shirt pocket, because some instinct told me I'd need more than my word alone. I called Michael that same afternoon and asked him to come by without Bridget. Told him it was important, told him I loved him, and that this wasn't easy for me either. He showed up 2 hours later looking pale, asking immediately if I was sick, if something was wrong with my health. I told him no, that this was about something else entirely, something I should have told him 2 years ago. I sat him down at that same kitchen table, poured him a cup of coffee the way he'd always taken it since he was 16, and I told him everything, starting with his grandmother's death and ending with the estate attorney who'd been sitting in that exact chair 3 hours earlier. Michael sat completely still while I talked, his coffee going cold in front of him, untouched. I told him about the 11 million first, watched his face move through shock, then something close to hurt, asking quietly why I hadn't told him sooner. I explained honestly that I'd been scared of exactly what had ended up happening, that money changes how people treat you, and I hadn't wanted it changing how anyone treated him either, especially not before his own wedding. He nodded slowly, absorbing that part, and I could see he understood it even through the sting of it. Then I moved to Bridget, and that's when his whole posture changed. I laid the probate timeline in front of him, showed him the dates side by side, his grandmother's estate clearing probate, the public filing date, his proposal 2 weeks later. I told him about Curtis, about the auto dealerships, about the job history Ray had pulled together, about the widow at her old firm. I played him a short piece of the recording from that morning, just enough for him to hear Bridget's voice explaining the family protection plan to an estate attorney she'd brought without asking me first. Michael didn't say anything for almost a full minute. He just stared at the folder Bridget had left on my counter, the one I still hadn't signed. When he finally spoke, his voice was steadier than I expected. She asked me twice last month if you'd ever mentioned changing your will. I hadn't known that detail. It confirmed everything Ray had already found, laid out fresh and painful from his own memory. He thanked me quietly. Then he asked for the folder, the recording, and Ray's full report, and he said he needed to go home and talk to his wife himself. Tonight, alone. I didn't hear from him for 3 days. Those were 3 of the longest days I'd had since the funeral. When he finally called, his voice sounded worn out, but clear, the voice of someone who'd already made a decision and just needed to say it out loud to make it real. He told me the conversation with Bridget had gone about as badly as he'd expected. She denied everything at first, then shifted to blaming me, calling me controlling and manipulative for keeping the inheritance secret in the first place, trying to twist the whole situation so that her own behavior looked like a reasonable reaction to my secrecy. Michael told her plainly that hiding money from your own son and secretly researching your father-in-law's net worth before proposing were not the same thing, and she didn't have a good answer for that. He also told me her mother, Sandra, had gotten involved, calling him directly to insist Bridget was overreacting and that every family looks out for its future, which only confirmed for Michael that Sandra had probably known exactly what her daughter was doing from the start. By the end of that conversation, Michael told Bridget he needed space, packed a bag, and drove to his buddy's apartment across town instead of going back to their place that night. He told me he wasn't making any permanent decisions out of anger, that he wanted a clear head first, but that something had broken that he didn't think could be fixed. Not after seeing that folder. Not after hearing her own voice on that recording explaining herself to an attorney like it was the most normal request in the world. I told him I was proud of him for handling it with a level head instead of rage. And he said something back that I don't think I'll ever forget. You protected me before I even knew I needed protecting, Dad. 6 weeks later, Michael filed for divorce. His lawyer explained that given how quickly things had unraveled and the clear evidence of what she'd been after before the marriage even happened, an annulment wasn't available under Ohio law given how much time had passed. But the divorce moved through fast and clean once Bridget's attorney saw the recording and Ray's report. She didn't fight it much once she understood what existed as documented evidence, correctly guessing that dragging it out publicly would only make her look worse. Sandra called Michael a handful more times, trying to smooth things over on her daughter's behalf. But Michael had stopped answering by then, telling me he'd already said everything he needed to say. I finally sat down properly with Michael a few weeks after that. No folders, no recordings, just the 2 of us at my kitchen table on a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I told him the rest of it, the parts I'd skipped over in the rush of that first hard conversation. I told him about my mother, about the years I never fully understood her, about the guilt I carried for not asking more questions while she was alive. I told him the 11 million sat there almost like a strange apology from a woman who never said much of anything out loud while she lived. I finally opened that letter and read it to him 3 handwritten pages where she explained, in her own blunt way, that she'd watched people change around money her whole life at that trucking company, watched good families torn apart by it, and she wanted me to be careful, to take my time, to let people show me who they really were before I ever let money into the room. I told Michael I wanted to set some of it aside for him properly now, with a lawyer, paperwork done the right way, not hidden, not rushed, and definitely not connected to anyone who hadn't earned that kind of trust first. He cried a little at that, not out of sadness this time, but something closer to relief. And he told me he didn't care nearly as much about the money as he cared about the fact that I'd been quietly watching out for him the entire time, even when he had no idea there was anything to watch out for. It's been almost a year now since that Saturday morning Bridget walked into my kitchen with an attorney trailing behind her like she already owned the place. Michael is doing well. He moved into a smaller place near the hospital where he works, started coaching a rec league basketball team on weekends, something he'd wanted to do for years but never had the time for while he was busy planning a wedding for a woman who was really just planning an inheritance. We talk most days now. Real conversations, not the careful, surface-level ones we used to have back when I was hiding something from him without even fully realizing how much that secret was quietly protecting him. I still think about my mother sometimes, about the years I spent not really knowing her, and about the strange way her money ended up doing something she probably never intended when she wrote that letter. exposing a woman who would have hurt her grandson if I hadn't stayed quiet long enough to see her clearly first. Folks sometimes ask me if I regret not telling Michael about the inheritance before the wedding, and the honest answer is no. Not for one single second. If I had told him, if I had told anyone, Bridget would have had exactly what she wanted from the very beginning, and I never would have seen who she really was until it was far too late to do anything about it. Staying quiet was never about hiding money from my son. It was about giving the truth enough room and enough time to show itself on its own, without me forcing it, without anybody having a reason to perform a kindness they didn't actually feel. Thank God I didn't say a word, because that silence gave me exactly what I needed. Real proof, real clarity, and a son who is safe, single, and finally free to build a life with someone who wants him for who he is, and not for what his father is quietly worth. If you made it this far, you already know this story was never really about the money. It was about paying attention and about trusting that quiet instinct that tells you something isn't quite right, even when everyone around you says you're imagining it. If this one hit home for you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what would you have done in my place. I'll see you in the next one.